all for being here. I'm excited to share this work with you. This is a result or a manifestation of a work from a lot of people on my team. So I'm the talking head up here. And Vivian Lin especially did a big part of this work. And every time she hears me give this presentation, she's like, well, Steph, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So just know I'm going sort of high level. But one of the reasons why I found decision making to be such an interesting topic is because I don't know how many of you have been in meetings where everybody gets so prepared for the meeting and then you get there and we can't like seal the deal. Like, I mean, whether it's trying to figure out what toothbrush to get in the aisle of like a million toothbrushes, let alone and where you might be investing millions of dollars in your business. And so I thought, well, let's just learn a little bit about that. So I'm going to share with you a presentation on some of the things we've learned about decision making. So if this works, and it's going to be great, I'm going to advance slides, and we're going to go. So basically, this comes as no surprise to any of you. Innovation is a very risky business. I think the statistics around innovation being successful is something like 1 out of 10 innovations are actually successful in the market. So the business that we're in design and development and innovation is very, very risky business. It can be very expensive and time consuming. And so that again is why I started this whole path on trying to understand decisions and decision making. And one of the things I've learned is that decision making can be extremely easy as long as everybody's in the right frame of mind, they've been well fed, they're in the room, they're on the same page, they're all swimming in the same direction, then decision making is incredibly easy. But if I skip lunch, if I had a fight with my husband, if I'm a little bit irritated for some reason, if I'm cold, it could be any number of things. It turns out that decision making can be very, very difficult. And yet we still have to make decisions big and little throughout the course of our day and throughout the course of our work. So how many of you remember New Coke? Yes. So this was, I think it's like if you type in bad decisions into Google, this will be the very first example that you see is New Coke, right? It's a quintessential bad decision, but what's really, really interesting about this example is that I think they did interviews with 20,000 people, taste test. And 20,000 people said, yes, we like this taste better. So they did their research, they did all their studies, they did everything that they needed to do to make the right decision. And yet, Coke Zero failed horribly. So for those of you who don't know, people started hoarding Coke, like buying all the cases. I think it was on the market for around 80 days before they sold it. So is this an example of making a bad decision? Well, on their website, they talk about this as actually an important lesson in decision making. That, in fact, they reflect back on it as an example of risk taking and how they did all of the right things, but bad decisions can still happen. And so if you make a bad decision, how do you quickly recover? And they did a remarkable job of quickly recovering. What's interesting is that the person who was in charge of this decision did not get fired. He's still with the company to this day, right? One of the things they learned from making this decision was how powerful their brand was and how deep their loyalty is. I don't know if any of you caught the news today, but Pepsi made a change in their formula. Like nobody started ordering. They did change back to their old formula using aspartame again. But this is a really important lesson for Coke about the importance of making big decisions and risky decisions and also recovering from them. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this all means and how to maybe avoid the whole like New Coke thing, but at the same time recover from decisions when they go wrong. What I would like you to consider is no matter what your job is, no matter what your title is, your job is ultimately to make and facilitate decisions for ourselves and for others. And if you think about that really, it becomes sort of an interesting thing to consider. That's a huge part of the work that we do every day. And I think maybe it's a little bit easier to make decisions for ourselves, but to help others make decisions and justify those decisions is where it can get really difficult. And so I'd like you to consider for a little bit that this is a key part of your job. And what's interesting is we're not really taught this in school, right? Not a lot of us are trained in how to make decisions. Decision making, it turns out, is a very well-studied field. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have gotten their PhDs in decision-making theory. And it all comes down to sort of 4 basic steps. Frame your decision, figure out what you're trying to decide. That's a good first step. Next, create real alternatives. So don't compare apples and oranges. Make sure that these are all real alternatives. Assess those alternatives, and then make a decision. It's simple, right? Like, what's the big deal? It's 1, 2, 3, 4. We can all do this. And yet it tends to be a little bit more complicated than that. And when you start to dig in and look at why that is, any kind of thinking is very energy intense. And we have 2 sides of our brains. We have our fast brain and our slow brain. Our fast brain has been evolving for many, many years, thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. That's the thing that tells us when a bus is coming to jump back, right? You don't think about it. You don't weigh the pros and cons of jumping out of the way of the bus. You just get out of the way, right? This part of our brain has been honed to be very fast and very, very effective. And yet, in our schools, in our studies, in our culture, we're trained to focus only on our slow brain, our very, very rational brain, and to put that at the forefront of our decision-making theory. And so one of the things that we see is that these 2 things can, and that very often we rely too heavily on one side more than the other. Decision-making is even harder still when you need to justify the decision that you're making. So consider this. I'll share with you a study that was done. So this was a study that was done at, where they took a group of students, undergrad students, who were not studying art at all. So they were not art historians. They didn't know anything about art. And they created 4 different cohorts. And they showed them 2 pictures. And they asked them a series of questions in order to study sort of the effects of how the questions were phrased and decision-making. So first they showed them this picture. These are both paintings by Piet Mondrian, the landscape, and this one. And what they asked the first cohort of students was, which one do you like best? So show of hands. Who likes this one that sort of is representational of trees best? And who likes the 4 abstract one best? Very interesting. So when they conducted their study and they said, which one do you like the most? About 50-50. Statistically pretty close. More people, obviously, I guess obvious to me. Like, this is better. No bias there. But it's really pretty close. Then they asked a similar cohort of students, same thing, except instead of saying which one do you like the best, they said which one do you dislike the most. They changed their responses. So again, we can change what people decide and how they decide with 3 letters. This is very, very important to keep in mind as we're helping ourselves and others navigate through decision making. Those 3 letters change the statistics. So it gets even weirder. Like, that's just sort of like, oh yeah. Okay, so they then took another cohort of students, all the same sort of criteria, and they said, which one do you like the most? And tell us why you like that the most. Justify your decision. 80% of the people chose this one. This is called verbalization bias, and what this is talking about is they had the words to describe it. They had a way of talking about it. So if you look at it then and say, which one do you dislike the most, this is crazy. This is the crazy town. People would rather tell you, talk about this one and why they dislike it, because they have the words and the language to talk about it. Now imagine yourself in a meeting where you are trying to get a group to make a decision and they don't have the language or the tools or the mental models to make a decision. You can dramatically change what decision is made by simply asking these questions. How many of you, when you make a decision in a meeting, have to justify your decision to somebody else? It's pretty much everyone. I mean, I have to justify why I bought these shoes to somebody else. So I mean, but it's kind of obvious. So like I said, this is called verbalization bias. So when asked to reflect verbally, people focus on attributes that are easy to verbalize and they're easy to rationalize. Whether that's easy or difficult, it changes people's preferences. You can say, oh, well, that's art. This has been done on jams. This has been done on all the studies and repeated on all kinds of different topics. So it's not just about art. So I think this is the kind of thing that I started to learn about where I thought, wow, this is really important to the work that we do here at Design Concepts. I'll give you an example, a personal example. I was in a meeting maybe a month or so ago. I'm an owner of the company. I'm supposed to have business sense. I get called into a meeting and I have to make a decision about our server. I'm like, I am a smart businesswoman and I am going to make a decision about our server. So I listen to these people talk. I have literally no idea what they're saying. It's going to be a huge financial investment. I don't want to be embarrassed or look dumb in front of my colleagues. So I'm kind of like, well, what do you think? You know? And what an uncomfortable position to be in, right? And I don't know how many of you have been in positions like this where you're like, what he said makes sense. I think it's something we talk about customer-centered research, we talk about user-centered research, we talk about empathy. But one of the things we often forget is having empathy for our colleagues or for others that we're asking to make a decision and we're not well preparing them for that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this presentation, is how do we not put people into that position where they can't make a smart decision, they don't know how to talk about it. How do we mitigate that? So that is going to be the bulk of the presentation from here on out. So, okay, some decisions don't require all of this effort and this work. I'm going to be focusing on decisions that maybe are a little bit murkier and a little bit more critical. The examples I'm going to walk you through are in the case of a project. So you can apply this to lots of things, but I'm going to be talking about in the case of a project that we do with somebody else. So, again, forget 4 steps. I boiled it down to 3. Look at how much easier I'm making decision making already. So how do we design for decisions? So the way that we've created this presentation is I'm going to say some things on the first slide that are kind of basic common sense, and then I'm going to talk about some failure modes. So forgive me for some of the basic common sense stuff, but we often overlook it, right? We all know we should do this, but we often cut corners. I don't know how many of you face this, but a lot of our clients come to us and they're like, can you go faster, 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 faster? We're like, yes, we can. And one of the first things that gets cut often is the preparing phase, the planning phase. And I think this is one of the most critical steps to having a successful decision in the end. So how do you prepare the way? So we launch a project. How do we prepare the way to make sure that we're making good decisions? We're documenting those decisions, we're making knowledgeable decisions, and we're able to share them with others. So preparing the way means, what do you need to know? What assumptions are you making? This is a really critical aspect of launching any project, is making sure we're being verbal about what assumptions that we're making. What's the organization's appetite for risk? Who are our stakeholders? What are the key pain points? And what are we deciding between? Sounds pretty basic, right? But how many times have you started a project or something that's going to involve a larger decision and you're not even sure exactly what you're deciding between yet? So some of this is about doing your homework and preparing your way. So let me talk about some common failure modes. One failure mode is that the team and the roles are unclear. So you start a project. This happens to us all the time. I've worked with you guys for 13 years. We start a project. We don't even bother having like a pre-launch meeting. We just go because I know you and I know you and I know how to do this. Let's go, right? We just skip over all of those steps about talking about, well, what's your role? Who is the decider? Who is the decision maker? Who are the influencers? Who are the key stakeholders? We fail sometimes to ask those questions of ourselves and the people in the room, but we also sometimes fail to ask those questions about our partners in our client organization. One of the things that's known about decision making is all of these people are super important to making the decision, but ultimately the decider decides. So figuring out who that decider is early on is critically important. And understanding that the decider can listen to all of this and decide that they're not going to go with everything that's decided or everything that the group has contributed to. So really, when you're creating a team and you're starting out on a project, make sure that you have a diversity of opinions, subject matter experts, you know who your decider is, and that everybody knows their role. So I don't know what it's like in your organizations, but I tend to work both internally and with my clients with a lot of type A people who are very ready to go. Like, let's go, let's do this, right? If they don't know their role, they tend to start contributing all over the place, and you start to get like into rabbit holes. So again, it's critically important for people to know what their role is. Another failure mode right out of the gate is no shared point of view. So one of the things we've found that really is important in helping make a decision is to create a statement of purpose. Sometimes people feel like we just launched this project or we just decided we're going to go down this pathway, and they haven't articulated a shared point of view. Sometimes it can feel a little early, like we don't even know what we're going to discover yet. How would we know? One of the things we really recommend is creating a statement of purpose. And then at every key milestone along the way, revisiting that. Because you're going to learn, and you're going to make changes, and you're going to make decisions, and you're going to need to reframe. So this is a key aspect of documenting sort of all the micro decisions along the way, and I'll get to this in a minute, of how to sort of mitigate some of the failure modes that might come later when it comes time to make a decision. The end. No, I'm just kidding. I tried to throw Thank you for coming. Have some margaritas. No, there's a little bit more. And then a lack of established goals and metrics. So I've been in a number of meetings where I have like a bunch of concepts up on the wall, and people are like, okay, choose a concept. Like we're asking our clients to choose a concept or a direction or opportunity, and yet we don't give them any way to compare those to one another. We have created no metrics. So again, in the preparation phase, it's really important to start listing what all of these, I call these semantic differentials. So start listing what are all the different trade-offs we might be making along the way. As you learn more and as you get further into your project, you might say you can start to prioritize these. But it's really important to capture all the different trade-offs you might be making much later on down the road and documenting those. Yeah. Which gets me to really a key point. So if you know you're embarking on a project that's going to have a big impact on your team or on your organization or on your family or whatever it is, I don't know, again, how often this happens to you guys, but I've been on a lot of projects where my client team, when I start it, is they're all gone at the end of the project. I have a totally different team at the end of the project. Or the key decision maker is left, or somebody is left, or 4 people have joined, and we have not done a good job of documenting all the micro decisions along the way. And so you get this, wait, what? But why? And you feel like frustrated because you have to go back and try to justify everything along the way, and you don't have all of that ready at your fingertips. So this is an important thing to consider. We've even gone so far when we're working with clients to hire a documentary photographer or a graphic visual illustrator to document all the key meetings so that there's a documentation of the discussion and the decisions micro decisions that were made all along the way. So when people join or leave, that we have that ability to trace back to justifying our decision. This is a book called Communicating the New by Kim Irwin. It's a really interesting book. I don't know if you have heard of it. What's interesting about this book is she talks about, because we talked about verbalization bias. she talks about how it's so difficult to get people to make a decision and to shape innovation when they have nothing to compare it to, right? Like, we didn't have a phone with music in our pockets before. So when someone's like, do you want to carry all of your music? You're like, well, I don't want to carry all my records with me or whatever, right? So we have a hard time making that leap. So she did a really great job of talking about different ways we can give people that language to both make a decision and justify it, which is why I recommend it. So in preparation for a decision, it's important to keep in mind their goals, their roles, shared point of view, common language. Basically, this is like do your homework, brush your teeth, eat your broccoli kind of advice, right? It's like, yeah, I know, but it's really helpful to consider when you're starting a project or an effort or embarking on making a big decision to really think about these things and really taking the time to consider them. Okay, so now it's the decision-making moment, right? So how do you design and facilitate the discussion and ultimately the decision? One of the things that I've been doing this for 26 years. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in where we work hard and we get our presentation and we're ready and we present it to our clients and we don't think about helping them make a decision, right? So we're like at the 10, we're at, what's the football-y thing? We're 10 yards from the goal and we're like, why can't we have a touchdown? Like, we can see it, it's not that far. Right? So I think we sometimes forget this last 10 yards. So how do you really choreograph a meeting, a decision-making meeting or a decision, right? How do you prepare people for that? So again, helping people, when you invite people to a meeting, make sure they know their roles. What are you expecting from them? What kinds of decisions are you expecting from them? Again, you don't want people contributing all over the place and confusing other people. So how do you sort of control that conversation? What criteria? Give people actual criteria. So they're like A, B, or C. A is more of this, and B is less of that. Again, super kind of simple stuff, but I hope a helpful reminder. And then we talked about verbalization bias. How do we give people the language and the tools they need to evaluate between these two options, right? A lot of people don't know how to do a critique, a design critique. You go to design school, you're taught how to do a critique. You're taught how to actually look at a design and take it apart. So how do we help people do that? This is one of my favorites. This is sort of ridiculous, and so I had a number of people say, like, no, you should tell your presentation. I'm like, but no, it's so ridiculous, I love it. There's been studies done that show that if you put somebody in a soft seat and give them a warm beverage to hold, that they are more likely to listen to your point of view and negotiate. So I expect that all of you are sitting on a hard chair and you think I'm kind of full of it right now. But it's really interesting. And so you're like, okay, so what am I supposed to do? We joked around that we were going to send out proposals with a cushion and a cup of tea and be like, pick us. But it's actually very interesting. And in fact, there's been some studies done that were just very recently published about studies they've done in interrogation rooms in police departments. And so they went from that like cold room, harsh light, that, like the Boston Law and Order, right? The light and the they've changed some of these rooms to have couches to make them feel more at home, make people feel more comfortable. They've given them some more beverages. They sit them down on the couch and they're like, how about that time though? You want to talk about that? And what they're finding is that people are like, I know. Not bad. But it's really interesting, and there's been a number of studies, like I said, done about how you can change the dynamic of negotiation and decision-making based on some really basic physical things, right? So in this case, it's really about setting the stage, like letting them know when there will be breaks, letting them know when they'll have time to check their cell phones or make calls, making them comfortable, making sure there's enough food. Don't give them the big, giant burrito and then ask them to make a decision an hour later. They're going to be asleep. So just thinking a little bit about setting that stage for that decision. I think this is really fascinating as well. We've heard about the wisdom of crowds, right? We've also heard that studies have been done that groupthink is bad. Which is it? Are the crowds wise? Groups aren't wise? What is it? I think this is fascinating. So it is true when you groupthink, when you ask a group of people to make a decision on the spot, they tend to be very risk averse. They tend to choose the choice that will create the least amount of conflict. So that's how you kind of come up with a lot of solutions. And think back to some of the meetings you've been in where you ask people to decide and everyone's like, I'll take the middle one because it's not too much of this and not too much that. And people are sort of choosing the least risky option. But crowds can be very wise, and why that is because they have a chance to think first before they share their opinion. And so decision making done, we get people together, we put them in a meeting, and we're like, okay, we're going to present a bunch of stuff to you, and they're going to make like a big business decision like now, right? And we don't give them time to think, we don't give them time to reflect, we don't give them time to critique and debate. And so this is a little bit about helping sort of think about what that means in your meeting. One of the ways that we try to mitigate that is by helping people play or bring into play both sides of their brain. So one of the things we do in this, like if I'm presenting 4 different concepts here, one of the first things I'll do is just read off the headline, basically, of each of the concepts. And I give them what I call a gut that says, love it, hate it. That's all I want to know from you. Do you love it or do you hate it? Like, what was your gut reaction when I said driverless cars, right? Like, and then we take that and we set it aside, and then we go through in detail each of the concepts, and we give them their slow brain, their rational brain, some worksheets where they can document what they think, what they've heard, how they might change the ratings of that. The other thing we do is we give them a few minutes. Quiet time. When's the last time you were in a meeting and everyone was like, okay, we're all going to sit quietly now for 5 minutes? You don't do that, right? And as a facilitator, it is extremely uncomfortable. I'm like, okay, y'all just think for 5 minutes. And I'm like, I hope they don't hate it. Like, you know, we're not used to downtime. We're not used to quiet time. We started doing this in some of our meetings, and it had a remarkable result. People love having the moment to think and reflect and to fill out some worksheets and compare to what they used to think to what they think now. And really, we've had amazing results with just giving people that little bit of time, right? Too much time can be your enemy as well, but all of this fasty stuff isn't always working. So in the moment of making a decision, set the stage, make people comfortable, build on the past, avoid groupthink, but focus on the wisdom of the crowd, and capture people's instincts and the rationalization. And then finally, committing to the decision. So again, I feel like very often we forget some of these core elements of decision making, and one of them is justifying, reminding, and sticking to the decision. So I had this client, I worked with them for a long time, and so we ended up being able to joke around with each other. One of the guys was the VP of R&D, and we would have these big meetings where we would make these big decisions so that we could continue the program going on. We can't decide what to do next unless you decide. And he would always come in, and he was great for people, and he would help everybody, and we would make a decision. At the very next meeting, he'd be like, wait, what? Wait, what? No. What about this? And we're like, whoa, we already decided a long time ago to put those things on the back burner for now. So we ended up having him sign a contract. After every meeting, we're like, I have agreed to X, Y, and Z, and he would sign his name. And so we would start every meeting being like, remember, and it was a way for us to sort of jokingly tease him and say, don't worry. He still said, wait, I know I said that, and I know I signed that, but at least it gave us a way of starting the conversation about like, okay, what do we need to do to get this to stick? So making it stick, again, I talked about documentation early on, sort of documenting all of those micro decisions along the way. So this is now pulling together that documentation, telling stories, and committing, because this is all about justifying your decision to others, right? This is all about that now. So what are some failure modes? I thought this was really interesting. In March this year, Harvard Business Review came out with a checklist for making faster, better decisions. So I was like, bingo, like, give it to me. It was a great, it was a good little article. But what fascinated me was 2 out of the 7 points that they made were about committing to the decision, committing and sticking to a decision that's been made. And I think that's really interesting. And I don't know, you can all reflect on your experiences, but people tend to have a little bit like, well, I don't think that, but what if we did everything and forget, right? So what this actually, the second part here is actually a quote from the presentation, or from the document. Writing these things down increases commitment and establishes the basis to measure the results of the decision. And again, that's something we often also struggle with is return on investment. How do we measure the results of the decisions? Well, if you create a great story and you create your criteria and all of that along the way, you'll be able to do that. Another commitment failure mode is lack of ownership. I think this is kind of another hilarious study. So they gave people a mug, travel mug, and they said, this is a $4 travel mug, we're giving it to you. And then 6 months, 8 months later, they said, okay, we want to buy back the mugs from you. And people valued it at $8. So there's this thing that in our heads that my stuff's more valuable than your stuff because obviously, I don't know why. But what does that mean to decision making, right? We talk about not made here, not my idea. We've done that before. Well, I think this comes to play a little bit in that. So when we are, every decision we make, somebody is going to have to keep it going. Someone's going to have to take that on. They're going to have to bring it to life, right? How do we give them a sense of ownership of it? Not be like, here, I made this decision. Here, you go make that happen. Right? But how do we make them a part of that and give them a sense of ownership so that they value it enough to commit to that decision? And then this is, I think, really interesting as well as the lack of follow-up. Like, decision made, drop the mic, head out. Again, a quote from Harvard Business Review. Schedule a decision follow-up in 1 or 2 months. We often forget to check in when decisions are going poorly, missing the opportunity to make corrections and learn from what's happened. And everyone's like, failure is okay, right? Well, it's not okay if you don't follow up and you don't course correct. Coke, New Coke was a really great example of that. They learned and they made a change and they followed up. So commitment success means documenting the decision, make it easy to trace, make it easy to share, help create a compelling story to help justify your choices, and make sure whoever will be involved next will be prepared. So in summary, understand the problem, make a plan, make sure you're understanding the context, shared language. We've often gone to the level of writing a definition of terms for projects we're on. Like, it should be luxury. Anybody want to define what luxury means and how we're going to measure luxury? So really being very, very clear about your language, making sure that you have shared knowledge and really understanding what options. In terms of the process itself, making sure people know their roles, who's the decider in the meeting. People need to know that. I like to be the decider myself, so if anybody ever needs a decider, I'm call. What criteria, how are you helping people compare these, and how are you giving the language that they need to actually make these comparisons? And then the commitment. Who is making the commitment? How are you making that commitment transparent? How are you justifying that to others? Storytelling, again, this is all back again to that whole justification part of it. And then what are next steps? Who are the internal, external champions, and how do you keep that decision alive and going? So basically the conclusion of my presentation. I just wanted to reflect back a little bit on something that we've been talking a lot here at Design Concepts. So we've been looking a lot at, again, in the world of faster, 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 we've been looking at lean startups, lean development, and sprints. And one of the things that really occurred to me, especially when I read this book, Sprint, is about the Google Sprint methodology. And I read the book, and I was like, oh, this is so great. This is wonderful. I love this. And I started to reflect on it, and I thought, the reason why I love this, it's a 5-day process for brainstorming. It builds on design thinking and agile development. And it occurred to me why this process seems so good to me. It follows all the basic tenets of decision making. You have clear criteria, you have clear goals, you understand who the decider is, everybody has roles, you have 5 days to get through it. It's all nicely laid out in a process. And so I was thinking, well, that's great, but every project or problem that we address doesn't always fit into a case where sprint is really good when you have very few criteria of which you're trying to navigate. Design thinking is really more about solving wicked problems, right, where you can't isolate any criteria, and it may not lend itself well to something like a sprint. And it just occurred to me that when we're facing wicked problems or bigger decisions, there's lots we can learn from decision-making theory and from some of the tenets of something like a sprint to help people feel, have those micro decisions along the way matter and document them and give them people a sense of progress rather than feeling like they have to wait until the very end for the big decision. So that is my presentation on decision-making, and I hope that some of it was a reminder, and some of it was a little bit of like, wow, humans are weird. And hopefully you got something useful out of it. So I will pause and see if there's anybody has any questions or comments.
I wonder about how the roles get defined within design concepts, but also with clients. I imagine it's different with every client, every project.
Yes.
And then how literally are they defined?
Yes.
Who is making the decision? What is my role as a participant?
Yeah, we work really hard at navigating that first phase and really being explicit and articulate about that. So unfortunately, very often the decision maker on our client's team won't be there for like 90% of the project, and so they're going to be operating a little bit within a vacuum, which gets back to documenting along the way. But we find that we launch projects with an expectation alignment exercise, where we try to really articulate, like, what kind of thinker are you, and what kind of role are you going to have in this project, and what's your default mode of thinking. And so we try to just be really explicit and articulate about the journey we're about to go on. And so I try to tell people, like, I'm a wandering muse. I think really big, and really little details make me anxious, and I tend to walk and talk. I use my hands, right? And it's just trying to be, I like to decide. So we try to just make sure that everybody on our team and on our client's team are really articulate about who's who. We also then work very closely with understanding who the key stakeholders and decision makers are on our client side, and very carefully choreographing. If we know that they're only going to be at certain meetings, we try to understand their style and how to prepare them to make a decision, because the last thing you want to do is take somebody like that and be like, put them in a room where they don't feel like they're there. Yeah. So I think it's just about being transparent about some of it.
I really appreciate the conversation about decision making, because I recently went back and watched, I think it's from like probably 20 years ago now, when Nightline did this thing about IDEO, and they did their deep dive on a shopping cart. I remember seeing that, and as an industrial designer thinking, it felt so like safe and something that I could do. And I thought at the time it was because, well, I'm an industrial designer and I know how to do this, so yeah, of course it feels comfortable, it feels good. But having recently watched it like a week ago, and all of the conversations about decision making, that's actually what made it felt like a, I hate to use the word safe, but like a process that could work, and why it felt good to kind of be in that moment, because people were making decisions along the way that stuck.
Yeah,
it's really important.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Maybe think back about projects you worked on that succeeded and failed. Some of these things will start to be like, oh yeah, maybe if we had.
Mm-hmm. So I'm in product development for a corporation, and a lot of you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I want to get your opinion, your advice on this. So the team that's assembled to make the product makes tons of decisions along the way, right? And when it comes time to the final step, which is a go or no go, that person sort of prides themselves on no background. They just want to look at the thing with fresh eyes and make a decision on that. So how do you, and they don't allow for a, here's why we made this decision, this decision, this decision. There's sort of, they like the idea that I have fresh eyes, I don't know any background, I'm just looking at,
speak to me.
I'm just looking at the baby. Show me the baby.
Show me the baby. What's ugly baby?
Right. So how do you, and there's only one choice sort of at that point, right? Too, right? It's like we've invested everything, we've made cuts from 20 concepts down to one concept. We show that.
That is hard.
Yeah.
Humans. I guess what I would try, I'm sure you've tried a billion different things, but I might try to meet him there and give him like a gut, like give him a worksheet that says like my gut reaction to this is this. Then 2 minutes to think. My second reaction is this, right? Or we really try to create different worksheets where we have people allow them to have their gut reaction, and they can go with that if they want. I mean, ultimately the decider decides. But if you could, I kind of treat everything like it's a research project. Researcher. So what you want is to gather data from him. Like, why did he love it, hate it, have that reaction, right? So if you can think about it more in like the long term, ask him to sort of document in his gut like what he likes, and then have him reflect on it and maybe give a little bit more data for you. Over the long term, you might have a better idea of what's driving his decisions. You know, whether or not you agree with his decisions, it sounds like he's the decider and that's it. So I guess I would treat it more as a research project at that point and just try to figure out what's working with him. And then also, I do think that there's a point when we just have to challenge, right? And no, we're going with my way. Don't do that. But yeah, it's really an interesting conundrum.
Kind of going on that challenging aspect, if you happen to be presenting to a client or on a project and you see groupthink happening, and you then have this decision that comes out and your gut is starting to tell you, oh man, oh, come on, can we go back to that? But yet you're supposed to be committed.
It's like Brexit. Sorry.
Yeah. I don't know who country. I mean, who would ever do that? What have you guys been in that situation? How do you take it?
Yeah, that happens. I think as a facilitator, and again, like I consider myself a facilitator in a lot of these meetings and a researcher. I see it happening, like, and it's like, if the train is just leaving the station, then I might say like, okay, stop, let's do like 5 minutes, everybody write down like pros and cons. I might follow up later and say, now that you've had a chance to reflect on this, can you tell me specifically what you liked and didn't like? So I guess I might treat it more like that. And then, again, that might give you the data you need to justify why you want to go into a different direction, right? So if the group decides, that can have power because it's a group, right? And people are like, you want to go against the group? But I think if you can collect some data and tell a story that sort of highlights another alternative, then that might be a way to sort of go back maybe a little bit and say, oh, I know we decided this, but please take into consideration.
So I come from a nonprofit world, we're a little bit different, but we do a lot of facilitation and research for committees, consortia, and a lot of our work is about building consensus.
Yes.
Because we don't have a decider, we have a committee. And and on top of that, we're often in virtual environments, as opposed to actually being together in a room. So given those two things, like, what can we do to encourage authentic communication between these groups in a way that builds consensus?
Yeah.
I mean, given all the research we can do.
Yeah, I guess some of the things that popped into my mind, you guys don't think I'm really way smarter than I am for asking the question. I think one of the things I might do is to try to maybe not make the decision in that meeting. So you don't want to give it too much time, but you might want to say this meeting is about us like getting smart and sharing opinions, and maybe sharing some of our gut reactions, and then maybe you follow up with like a survey or something that gets more of their sort of considered, thoughtful, like, now that I'm away from it, have you guys ever done a survey or like a focus group and you like get home and you're like, oh, well, what I should have told them was this, right? It's that little bit of reflection, maybe follow up. And again, not too much time because people then like forget all of that. But maybe the next day, follow up with a survey of some kind that says like, now that you've had a moment to reflect. It's a really simple thing, but one of the things we often do is ask people, rather than asking open-ended questions like, what do you think? We say, well, what do you like? I like, I wish, I wonder. What did you like about it? What do you wish you saw that you didn't see? And what do you wonder? And people have a very hard time giving people critique. And so that feels like a very safe way to invite people in to sort of share what they're thinking.
First of all, I do think you're very smart.
Thank you.
I'll
give you the money later.
My question is, a lot of us oftentimes do just like she was saying, virtual. You know, we're remote, and so we're meeting with a product steering group, and we need them to make a decision. And we're remote, we're on a phone, can't see anything that's going on in the room with this group, and we're trying to get them. I actually, at one point in time, it went so off the rails that I said to them, obviously, since we've gone way off the rails here, the decision is yes, and I'm going to go with that. And then, of course, that's the biggest laugh I've ever gotten in my life. But so what are some possible strategies in regards to trying to get a group to make a decision when you're remote and you're on the phone?
It's hard. It's super hard, and it is a nightmare. It really is a nightmare. Especially because you're probably dealing with time differences. Some people are tired, some people are awake, some people are hungry. I guess I would go back a little bit to making sure you prepared them to make a decision, helping them know what they're deciding between, getting their input on the criteria upon, because we want to make this objective, right? We don't want it to be like, well, it's my opinion versus your opinion, so how do we make it objective, right? I think the criteria really help with that. It's like we all agree that these are the top 3 criteria. This one is heavy, this one is light, this one is expensive, I don't know. You know, going through that and having them score choices. And then, again, gathering data. I've done that even where I will do an online, like a survey, where people are giving their opinions. I think I'm going to have to look at my team. I think sometimes, I think maybe GoToMeeting or some others allows you to do that kind of online surveying so that people can be even sort of anonymously giving their thoughts or rating or ranking things. And again, trying to treat it more like research and being like, I'm here today to gather your opinion. And then I will work with, you know, whoever to make a decision or whatever.
Most of the time,
and
trying to get a decision.
Then there's a unicorn comes in. Yeah, it's. I mean, so many people have done so many studies on trying to help with this, but my main objective is to just make it less subjective, have people agree on the criteria, have people measure, express what they think, how each of these different decisions meets the criteria, and then the decision becomes a little bit more clear. And again, if someone disagrees, then you have a chance of saying, like, okay, well, that's data. How do we deal with that as data rather than obstructionism, which, yeah. Leah.
I have a question from Josh, who is participating on the webinar.
Hi, Josh.
If you have a team who have worked together on several projects with specific roles, is it really necessary to go through and define their roles?
Yes. Okay, yes and no. I think that we have to always allow people to be new, to take on a different role. I might be, in my title, I'm the director, but on this team, I might not even be the lead researcher. I might just be in a support role. And so I think really making clear what role I'm playing, how I like to work, how I like to think, I think is really critically important. And I find that we skip that so often because we're like, oh, well, I've worked with you before. But little do I know that right now, one of your growth opportunities is to be more decisive. And so now I'm like, why is Bob, who's usually so easygoing, being like so aggressive, right? So you have to sort of allow people to
have that ability to talk about, maybe on this project I want to work on this skill set. Listening might be a good one for me. So.
I have a question about the documentation phase of the project. Do you have any simple best practices for organizing all the information that is part of a project, whether it's the meeting notes or survey information or worksheets, so that the capture is thorough, but you can still find valuable things easily at a later date so that the documentation is actually valuable?
It's my library science.
Yeah.
Yes. Killing me. I will tell you, I don't think this is exactly an answer to your question, but it's words, and I'm like a politician. I'll just say whatever I want to say. You feel like I answered your question. We often rely heavily on PowerPoint, which I think is a narrative tool, is a good storytelling tool, and it's not a good tool for documentation and decision making. So in that regard, we usually do big posters where we are putting everything on the poster for this choice and everything on the poster for this choice, using all of the same sort of formatting so you can compare. So people can stand back and look at 30,000 feet, how do these compare, and then get down to detail and look at how do they compare, because PowerPoint's linear, right? So I think some of it is the linear storytelling, some of it is the posters. I found people like keep those posters and like hang them up in their office once the decision has been made as like a visual reminder of the decision that's been made. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can do it to make it sort of more of a tangible object than a thought in people's heads, right? We've even gone so far as making totems, like hot glue guns, and a little object, and make something that represents the decision so that it becomes more tangible. That answers the question.
I think that's a really important point, is to capture information in different modes, because, you know, like, I don't know if you've ever been in an elevator where you're on the 5th floor, you're also on the purple floor, it's also the floor named, and there's a song playing called Eye of the Tiger. Like, it's like trying to make sure that you have all the things that you need to remember, you know, like the decision you make to park on number 5. And so it's kind of the same way as like posters and the PowerPoint and the notes and all of that. Those are all really important ways to capture information.
I also like to just give it some homework beforehand, not too much, just enough. It's hard because people won't read it, they won't do it. Most important decision in the world, they're not going to do it. So just whatever, even if it's just like, here's your role, here's what you expect. I also try to help people understand in this meeting, in this decision, the next meeting, here's what we're going to decide here, which is why it's so critically important that we get to this decision today. I find that kind of context really helps people. Otherwise, they're like,
Great talk. You know, one of the things I was thinking about is that I like the aspect of communication, but slightly for a different reason. And it is because a lot of times organizations think that good decisions necessarily mean good outcomes. And I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. You can make a great decision, but still have an unlikely outcome. And vice versa, you can make a bad decision, but by a stroke of luck, you can make a great outcome. So having that communication in place gives you a chance that after the project is done, if it did not yield the result that you want, you can go back and trace what did we decide, because decision making is very dynamic.
right.
At this point in time, these are the facts that we took into consideration, but 6 months later, the marketplace will change. So by documenting that, you can really go back and say, here's what happened at this point in time, and learn from that, and enrich the conversation.
I think that's really true, and I think that documentation of all those micro decisions along the way is so critical, and it's something that's hard to do because you're in it and you're swimming, right? We've had clients actually go ahead and bring a graphic illustrator to all the key decision meetings to just document the conversation. We've gone so far as videotaping them so people can go back and look at them. Kind of hard because no one's going to want to sit through a 3-hour meeting of everybody, right? So I think there's a lot of, I think it's a really important consideration to think about, and obviously it makes it's more important for really big decisions where you know somebody's going to have to invest a lot of money or things that may change dramatically, to go ahead and make that commitment to that level of documentation early on.
When you, as a facilitator, how do you discern, especially in the moment, between someone reacting positively or negatively to the concept or manifestation, or to what's behind it. So obviously, as consultants, you guys are making decisions. Here, working by ourselves, and when we go to present something, we may have presented it on a poster or you present a concept. How do you know they're reacting positively or negatively to the representation or to what's at its core, what's behind it?
It's hard. I think we work hard at trying to take away some of the fluff and stuff. So we might represent something 4 different ways, right? So one of it may have no branding on it, because branding can affect people's perceptions in like a crazy way. So we try to do a series of reveals, if you will. So one of the examples I have is I did a project many, many years ago for McDonald's, and they had their kitchen, their chefs in their kitchen, they wanted to start selling pizza. So they made all these pizzas and tested, and in blind taste tests, head-to-head with their competitors, the pizza that came out of their kitchens was the best in terms of taste. Once they branded it, they lost every single time because people didn't want that, to allow them to give them that leeway with their brand. And so I think it's important also to sort of help, again, navigate people through the decisions. Like, what's the first decision we have to make? Okay. And what's the next decision we have to make? Rather than being like, do you want this? Do you want this? Right? It's hard. People can only handle, I think it's something like, I think they say that people can handle 7 plus or minus things in their mind at the same time. I'm not that person. It's about 3 or 4 for me. I can only compare 3 or 4 things at a time before I'm like, I got overloaded. And I don't need it.
Yeah. Back to the change management strategy. How do you deal with the resistance, not from the emotional side, but from the rational side? And I'm talking structural resistance, sabotage in many ways. And the case is, in my previous life, I had experience with very large companies becomes like a government, where you have a mandate from the top down, and when you get to the middle layers, then you have this resistance. Not that I don't like it, is that I'm going to do all my best for this next progress. So you get to the decision makings, and the objective of them is actually the opposite of what you're talking about. Less clarity, better, because then later we can change it. Commitment, minimum. So I can later on do it. I had a case of a middle management who was telling me, your idea is so great that we just have to make it bigger. And the strategy is make it bigger, that would never happen. So how do you deal with that?
Wine. Helpful.
W-I-N-E or W-H-I-N-E?
All of the wine. All of the wine. Yeah, that gets, there's a lot that's been done and published on this about top-down versus bottom-up and how people, I've gone to projects where half the organization is really excited about an idea and the other half of the organization decides to right? Very difficult. I think it has to come from the top and it has to come from the bottom. I think people need to be incentivized, right? So one example is that, from my own experience, is that the people who were to take the idea on and make it live, right? They weren't being incentivized. Their bonuses structured. They weren't going to get their bonus if they did this, right? So it gets down to like how are people even compensated, and it becomes very complicated. I don't know. I think sometimes it's a little intractable. I don't know unless you can help them understand what the personal benefits for them really. They're not going to get on board, right? So I don't think that anybody else has a story that wants to share. It's a very good question. Again, I think I look at it as try to take it as research data for the next time. And say, like, how do we navigate that needs to happen next time?
Certainly for design concepts, when you guys design a product, what methodology do you use in terms of evaluating the alternatives, or quantitative versus qualitative?
Yeah, that's a good question. We start out when we're in the discovery process of trying to figure out like what's the world of available options. It's very qualitative. Once we get down to refining and validating ideas, we get more quantitative. So if we are trying to figure out what's a brand new thing that may not exist in the world, we're going to go and try to understand deeply these models and their behaviors and look for things that sort of make connections that are non-obvious. Once we get down to, it's one of the reasons why we brought on business strategy a few years ago as part of our decision-making team internally, is so that we are making sure that what we're looking at and recommending is feasible in terms of is it feasible, viable in terms of business. Like we can make money, we can do it at cost, the manufacturer can actually manufacture this. Feasible in terms of it doesn't like break the law of business, which most ideas currently do, and desirable, that people want it, right? So we try to make sure we're constantly triangulating around all three of those things, so that we're not, suggesting something that everybody thinks is great, but we can't do it at cost.
Involved in product development, product design. Which voice do you trust? The initial reaction or the rational one?
I love doing this in meetings, getting people to give me their gut, and then sometimes I collect it, depends on the group, collect it and feed it back to them later, and sometimes I just have them hold it and then talk about it later. It's less important to me which one wins out in the end, as much as they understand they have both of the things going on and we have a discussion about it. And those can be really fun discussions. Like, I thought that was the stupidest idea I'd ever heard, but now that I think about it, blah, 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 now I see that's a very good idea, right? But it's just a tool for helping them think. It's a thinking tool. I would say I have probably cultural anthropology, not engineer. Probably I'm on the little gutsier side of things. But I think both are really important, and I would hate to ignore either one. But we're not very good at trusting our guts, so I think it's hard for people.
I think in the case of moving quickly, that we're seeing that it's valuable to take the risk of trust.
Yep.
Gut.
Yep.
And move on.
Yep.
If you have to make an adjustment later, do that. But
right. I think that's really true. And I just was looking at another study that said that people's guts are really smart and they're really well informed, especially if they've been involved in the field for a long time. Like, they might not be able to articulate it, but they've been selling hamburgers for 40 years. So their gut is super well informed, and we really, really should trust their gut. Versus people who are like, well, I've been working for the company for 6 months and my gut says this, right? It's like, I don't know. It may be a less informed gut. I mean, our guts are very educated, right, in many ways.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of times when you say gut, we're really asking for only time where you give a true opinion. Sometimes if you're just judging rationally, you might be really disappointed with the aggregate of it.
Yeah.
You left something out, you didn't criteria are wrong.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I have seen people overrule themselves. I think you bring up another really good point, is we're not taught how to give critique, right? And so by giving people a chance to play their gut card, at least give them that one moment of like, they don't have, like, we're not going to hold you to your gut. You just tell me, like, just tell me it's okay and no pressure. We'll discuss for hours if you want, right? But just give me your gut. So I think that plus the I like, I wish, I wonder, there's a lot of different tools you can use to help people learn how to give critique without feeling like they're being sort of negative. I did a presentation a few weeks ago on brainstorming, and one of the things that I thought sort of I relearned in creating that presentation was how we're so into like, let's all agree and everything's good, everybody's agreeing. So in brainstorming, it's like there's no such thing as a bad idea, and come up with lots of ideas. And I think that's really beneficial, but at a certain point, to really get to good ideas, you need to do critique, and you need to debate, and you need to argue, and you need to play different roles. I'm going to be the devil's advocate right now, and I'm going to tear this thing apart. Or, okay, you guys are going to be the competitors, and we're going to be this, and we're going to fight it out, right? We've taken away a lot of that important sort of debate from a lot of our conversations by trying to do everything by consensus and, you know, all of this. So I would also bring that in as like, what are safe ways we allow people to sort of give their opinions without being like, well, Bob thought that was a bad idea, but we thought it was great. Like, how do we encourage that in our groups and in our conversations? Like, how do you get that trust there so that people can debate and not feel like they're being negative? All right, so there's really great margaritas out there and wine. So, any other questions before we adjourn? Thank you all very much for your questions and for coming. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.